MMORPGs are something that have always fascinated me, which is why over the years I have tried various games in the genre. But ultimately, none of them would ever really hook me. Some would come closer than others, managing to keep me for a couple months. However, I would always move on and rarely would I come back. That is until I truly gave Final Fantasy XIV a shot, and since then it has become my most played game by a wide margin. So when it comes to the question of is it worth playing, the only answer I can really give is yes. But that conclusion invites other questions. Why is Final Fantasy XIV special? How does it succeed where others fail? And most importantly, is it the right time to give it a try? The most defining trait of Final Fantasy XIV has to be its story, which shouldn't be a shock given that it is, of course, a Final Fantasy, a series that has long been praised for its complex characters and storytelling. But even among its kin, it excels, with 14 having one of, if not the best story in the series, with characters that have quickly solidified themselves as iconic figures to the franchise. And it's this aspect of the game that makes it such an appealing choice for those new to the MMO genre, because at the end of the day, it's a full-length Final Fantasy. So even if you don't end up liking the traditional MMO elements, you still have a game that you can play and enjoy, that entices and helps pull you to the end, rather than just having the leveling process serve as a vehicle to reach the end game where you actually are able to take part in the core gameplay, which is unfortunately how many other MMOs tend to function. You see, 14 does a great job of slowly adapting players to the idea of group content, with the story requiring you to try various dungeons, trials, and raids to progress. And while in the recent years these have been made more solo-friendly with the introduction of trusts that allow you to do certain content with NPCs, the fact the game makes you do these pieces of content ensures that the player is going to slowly become more comfortable and overall better as they continue, to the point that by the time you reach the end game, though there will be an increase in difficulty as things become more current, you'll be more prepared to handle it and less likely to be overwhelmed, which again is something that many other MMOs fail at. Take World of Warcraft as an example. You can very quickly and easily make it to max level in the endgame without ever taking a single step into a dungeon, because they're usually not required. And an unfortunate consequence of this is that you're generally going to have a much harder time when trying in-game content in WoW than you would in Final Fantasy XIV. And this has nothing to do with difficulty. Rather, it's a question of how these games prepare their players. If WoW required new people to try dungeons every 5 or 10 levels, this wouldn't be an issue, and you would see a notable increase in the average skill level of newer players. And this is not me saying that WoW is bad, as this is not just a WoW issue, because like I alluded to earlier, it's a common problem that many MMOs suffer from, to the point that Final Fantasy XIV is somewhat unique for how it approaches its leveling process, as it puts the RPG first so it can help guide new players to those MMO aspects. Though Final Fantasy XIV does put heavy emphasis on its story, it is still an MMORPG, meaning one of the core aspects of the game is reaching the end to partake in every piece of current content, whether it be the new dungeons, trials, raids, or anything else introduced in the latest expansion. And part of the reason that this tends to be such an important aspect of MMORPGs is because far too often will you just miss out on some content if you weren't there when it was relevant, which is actually a problem that 14 does a fantastic job of addressing, because in 14 there is actually very little content that you as a new player won't be able to experience, as the vast majority of things that are added to 14 are either able to be done solo, you can queue for, or belong to roulettes that not only put people in older content, but also incentivize them. And the best part of this is that anytime you enter an instance in 14, the game will sync your level and gear, making it so the experience is at least somewhat similar to how it was when it was initially released. Realistically, the only thing as a new player that you'll likely miss out on is doing the previous expansion's harder content, as things like Extremes or Savages aren't something that you'll be able to get in a roulette unless you're a mentor. But even in those cases, if you're determined to try older hard content, you can do it synced with minimum item level, given that you're able to get a group to do it with you. And doing this makes it almost as difficult as it was when it was first released. Now, the reason that I mention all of this is to say that unlike most other MMOs, there isn't really this need to rush to the end game. You don't have to worry about missing out on things you might be interested in, so you can take your time, enjoy the game at your own pace, and you don't have to worry about the pressure of reaching the end. In fact, let's address another aspect of endgame for many MMOs, gearing. Another fear that new players may have, especially if you're coming from another MMO, is that once you reach the end, you'll be so far behind on gear that you'll be unable to do anything. But again, this isn't an issue in 14. From the moment that you reach the end of the story, you're more than capable of doing essentially anything. And that includes in-game fights like Extremes and Savages, because it takes all of 2 minutes to get any job geared enough to do that content. Because traditionally the gear used to start in-game content actually comes from crafting, meaning that you can very easily buy a full set of gear that you'll need to get into these instances. But even beyond that, as time passes, 14 tends to add various ways to easily gear your character once you reach the end game so that you can get right into whatever fight that you want. Now, so far, when talking about the end game, we've only mentioned the high-end content, but that's not all there is. In fact, a large portion of the player base will never set foot in a Savage or an Ultimate. Instead, many choose to partake in the various other forms of content that 14 provides, such as housing, collecting, RP, PvP, deep dungeons, Eureka, the Gold Saucer, or even crafting and gathering, which, unlike other MMOs, actually have a significant amount of depth, with crafters having actual rotations. And while Miner and Botanist are rather simple, Fisher is so complex that the go-to guide for the job is over 300 pages. I'm not exaggerating when I say people will play this game just to fish, which is to say there's more to do in 14 than just the high-end content. Whether you're a casual player logging in at 5 AM to catch a fish, or a more hardcore player staying up to 5 AM to try and clear a fight. I've talked about the RPG, I've talked about the MMO, so now let's talk about the pros and especially the cons. Because if I'm going to recommend you play something, it's only right that I make the bad just as clear as the good. Starting with the pros, possibly the biggest advantage of Final Fantasy XIV is the fact that you don't need to make an alt, as your character is capable of using and switching between every job. And that actually leads us into the next pro, which is the fact that 14 doesn't usually waste your time. This is particularly advantageous if you're the type of player that likes to collect items, as very few things in this game are truly locked behind RNG. And this is because there tends to be systems that ensure that you'll eventually be rewarded. For example, most Extremes have mounts that rarely drop when you beat them, and you could very easily clear a fight 200 times and never see a single mount drop. And even if you did, you'd likely have to beat 7 others to actually get it, meaning it could take you an incredibly long time to even get one of these mounts. Thankfully, to alleviate this, anytime you clear a hard piece of content, you're rewarded with a totem that can be exchanged for any reward from that fight, including the mounts, meaning you'll never have to run any given fight more than 50 or 100 times. And if you're doing Savage, you can rest easy knowing that no matter what, you're guaranteed a piece of gear eventually, because you'll be able to buy it with those tokens that we mentioned earlier. The next big pro to 14 is, of course, its ridiculous free trial. Being able to play this game all the way to Stormblood is actually insane. You're looking at 200 plus hours of just the main story, all for free. And if you start doing optional content, that number is only going to skyrocket. It's actually absurd how much of this game is available for free. And the trial alone is enough of a reason to give the game a try. But with that, let's move on to our last pro, which is the community. As a new player, you're likely going to find that most people want to help you. They want to see you succeed, and they want you to make it through the game, and so you're unlikely to see much of any negativity as you make it through your journey. But with that, we move on to the cons, the first of which is the community. Now, while you'll likely not see anything negative in-game, the 14 community isn't perfect. Like every big community, you're going to have toxic elements whom unfortunately tend to be the loudest. And for the record, I'm not referring to anyone specifically. This is just a universal rule of the internet that I want to make clear 14 isn't immune to. But overall, I do consider the greater whole of the 14 community to be rather good. Just try to avoid Twitter and especially the forums. Speaking of which, our next con is the fact the game is more difficult to buy than it should be because of their website. And then there's the issue of the Steam version, which requires you to take even more steps to do basically the same thing, and in all honesty, they really should streamline the process because doing anything on the website is just a pain. But with that, let's move on to the last big negative, which is the dreaded A Realm Reborn. Now, if we're being honest, this used to be a much bigger issue than it is now. AR was a slog to get through, and because of that, many people would quit before making it to Heavensward, the expansion that basically hooks everyone. However, in the last couple of years, the dev team have made an effort to alleviate many of the problems that made ARR so painful to get through, removing several unnecessary or redundant quests, greatly helping the overall pacing, along with also revamping some dungeons to make them more engaging. But while the base patch of 2.0 has greatly improved, the post-patch does still suffer, to the point that new players are still going to have to push through to make it to the award-winning Heavensward. With everything mostly covered, there's still one thing left to do, and that's to answer the question posed in the title. Is it worth starting Final Fantasy XIV in 2024? To mimic what I said in the beginning of this video, the only answer I can give is yes. The story alone makes it a game worth trying, and as of Endwalker, the first part of our journey has come to a close, meaning that you'll be able to experience this grand tale in its entirety. And better yet, you'll be able to witness the beginning of a new journey and story with the next expansion Dawntrail that is releasing later this year. And an expansion release is always a magical experience no matter the MMO. Being ready to see all that a new expansion is going to bring and being able to share in the collective hype is going to be some of the most fun that you'll have with the game. And I highly recommend starting now so you can make it to the end and share in that new expansion experience. Also, the fact you can go through half the story for free thanks to the trial means there's not much barring you from at least trying it, a statement which is even more true now that the game is coming to Xbox. So, if you're even a little on the fence about the game, just try the trial and I promise you won't be disappointed. If you've made it this far, first, I want to say thank you for watching, and hopefully this video provided you a little bit of insight and helped you decide whether or not you're going to give the game a try. If you did enjoy the video, then please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel, as I do make various videos about 14, including different guides aimed at helping new players. Like this video going over everything you need to know when starting 14. Also, let me know in the comments if you're going to give the game a try, or just ask any questions you may have and I'll do my best to answer them. But with that being said, again, thank you for watching, and I wish you the best on your new journey.